Ben Pearson, the Roaster Tracker. We're going to do something a little bit differently today. Specifically, we're going to look at a video from another YouTuber by the name of Common Sense Skeptic. This guy is very, very skeptical of a lot of things, especially a lot of things SpaceX. And I've had some comments on my videos as to debating some of the stuff he's talking about. I'm not going to look at every single one of his videos, but we are going to look at one particular one, which is the fourth video that he has on Starship, which has to do with some of the logistics and things, make some comparisons to Columbus, for instance. And we're going to see how these videos compare and try to get some kind of a grasp of how real this actually is. So let's take a deep dive into the Common Sense Skeptic and we'll go from there.
They could abandon ship in lifeboats or jump overboard. And then there were two other ships traveling in their convoy, so one of them could stop and pick up the stranded sailors out of the sea. If a sailor was out of reach, he could swim over to his rescuers. None of the above is true en route to Mars.
This isn't really true. First of all, we know that from the very, very first mission plan, there were 2 ships carrying crew and 2 ships carrying cargo. This was in Elon Musk's presentation from the very, very beginning when he started to talk about Starship publicly, before it was called Starship. The ships will be flying in some kind of a formation, and if there's some kind of an issue, they could presumably dock with one another and be able to do whatever they reasonably well could. This one doesn't really hold water.
Sea salt, sodium chloride. Without this simple compound, human life ceases to function. Salt is crucial to human muscle and nerve function, as well as maintaining fluid balance. Hyponatremia is a condition brought about by low sodium intake, which starts off as headaches.
Salt? What are you talking about here? We have astronauts that have lived on this space station for a year and salt has not been an issue. Salt is part of the food. It just is going to be included things. It's not something we're likely to have a lack of. I don't go putting salt on all of my food because there's so much salt in the food already that I don't need to have anything extra. Yes, in a completely deprived environment of salt, it is a detriment. But seriously, where do you come up with this stuff? And if it is an issue, the amount of salt that you need is very, very little. You could just take a box full of salt and you'd be able to do whatever you needed to do with it. Really?
Salt and pepper shakers are absent on the ISS because the powders cannot be dispensed on food in space.
Okay, so there's no salt shakers on the space station. You're going to have food, at least during the space voyage part of it, that is seasoned as you would properly want, although you could use some kind of liquid type seasonings. They do this kind of thing on the space station. People have lived on the space station for 20 years at this point in time. Not really an issue.
Let's go down a list of some of the things that Columbus's sailors could do that Musk's Martians will never be able to do again after they leave Earth. Breathe fresh air.
Okay, you got a point. They're not going to be able to have fresh air. Now, is this the end of the world? Well, it is something that they would lack, but people have lived in the space station, people live on submarines for months. It's not really that big of a deal.
Enjoy the sunshine on their skin.
Sunshine on the skin. This is wrong. They can feel sunshine coming through a window, and because the sun is brighter when you're in space, you could have something similar to the sunshine feel on your bare skin. Just like when you're in a car, you feel the sunshine on your skin. Yeah, they're going to have windows. These will be necessary to grow plants. So it's not like they're going to be in an artificial environment all the time.
Walk or run around on the deck.
Walking, running. Okay, when you're in zero gravity, you're not going to be able to do this. When you actually get to Mars and they start to have larger domes, you could do this, but it's going to be somewhat limited. We don't know how running is going to be when you're in 1/3 gravity. That's just not something we can really do unless we made a big, giant artificial gravity space station. There's some kinds of tests, though, but yeah, it's hard to say. I don't think this will be a huge concern, though, but time will tell, to be honest.
Work and exercise in normal gravity.
Work, exercise, like, who really enjoys working in Earth gravity? I mean, yeah, there is some kind of benefit to the exercise, but if you can lift a 50-pound bag of concrete and it's not nearly as heavy as 1/3 of the gravity, that's just going to make things easier. I think a lot of people will enjoy doing that.
Go swimming in the sea.
Okay, swimming, yeah, that's true. For some people, that will certainly be something to lack, but personally, I don't always like to go swimming that much. And, you know, when it starts to get to be larger bases, they maybe have the ability to swim, but yeah, you got me. Swimming is not something you're going to be able to do.
Bathe.
For the trip to Mars, bathing of any kind is not really going to happen. But once you get to Mars, especially when you have a good supply of water, which the early missions that Elon Musk is planning to go to Mars will go to an area where they can dig up water, you're really not going to have an issue. You can make a shower in Martian gravity. You can even do one in zero gravity. But for the trip there, for a couple of months, you're not really going to be able to bathe standard. That's true. But this is something astronauts have been dealing with for a long time, and it seems like it's something that could reasonably well be done.
Collect rainwater if their water at sea runs low.
Collecting rainwater was not something that ancient sailors did. It did happen on an occasion, and it was mostly a means to kind of prepare things, but you couldn't count on going through storms. And in fact, they would avoid a storm if they knew about it because it would be a danger to the ship. Even a modest amount of rain, it's still too risky, and if you can see a storm, you're going to avoid it. And besides, how would you collect it? The best way to collect rainwater is if you have a large surface, something like a roof, that will have all of the water that's coming down collected into a single point. That works wonderful. You don't really have that kind of thing. You have the deck of a ship, but if you're in a storm, then the deck of the ship may also have ocean water that's going on there. It can be done, and it has been done historically, but this is not something that is very likely to be done and has not been done historically. So you kind of leave with the same supplies that you left with on a ship anyways.
Net fish, collect seaweed, and shoot birds if they became short on food.
The hunting and fishing, when you're at deep sea, they weren't really done that much for a number of reasons, but it wasn't something you could depend on. And even if you caught this food, you're still going to have to find a way to cook it, so you're going to have to have the supplies, or you're going to eat things raw. This could be done in an emergency, sure, but practically speaking, it wasn't really done. If this is what you had to depend on, you were in a lot of trouble.
Bring domesticated animals with them for food, milk, or eggs.
Animals were pretty rare on ships in the earlier days of the transportation. Sure, they did take some of them back and forth. And the fact that we have things like horses and cows here in the Americas is clearly evident of that. But in the earlier days, it wasn't done. And it's true that on Mars, you're not really going to be doing this a whole lot. But eventually they'll get there. And by the time we start to send 1 million people to Mars, that has a fairly high likelihood of happening.
Oh, and have sex. We'll come back to that one.
And the sex question. This is something, quite frankly, we don't know. I'm going to assume that it's entirely possible to do so in Martian gravity. Having children, we really, really don't know the effects of pregnancy. That's something that is being studied on mice on the space station right now. But quite frankly, we just don't know enough here, one way or another. It's really premature, though, to say that it's completely not going to happen at all.
Martians can't bring fire to Mars. On a planet where the average temperature is minus 60 Celsius, if your heater breaks down, you cannot light a fire to stay warm. There's nothing to burn, and there's no oxygen in the Martian atmosphere. So one of man's very first discoveries will have to be abandoned on Earth.
Okay, you're not going to light a fire on Mars. That's totally going to be the case. But is that really that big of a deal? The heat is, of course, going to be an extremely important thing. They're going to have backups and backups of backups to get the heat to work. This will be absolutely required. In fact, quite frankly, they can build a nuclear power plant that doesn't take a lot of moving parts that can produce more than enough heat for a small base. And when they start to have backup power sources and the ability to manufacture some of the stuff on Mars, then it's going to be so much the better. We've lived on the space station for a number of years. I have never seen an instance where the AC system failed. So that's just kind of bogus. But, sure, we won't have fire as a backup. I'll give you that.
Complex Martians headed back to Earth will require a supply drop before they can even think about taking off.
Requires a supply drop? What? Okay, first of all, the way he talks about this, you're going to send 100 people from Earth to Mars and then send them back 2 years later. That's not going to happen. That will not happen. The 100-person to Mars, the idea is to colonize Mars. They're not going to be coming back, most of them. You'll have a few people who may come back, but not that many. And by the time you're doing that, you're going to be growing food on Mars. You're going to be semi-self-sufficient. You won't be self-sufficient in some of the higher stuff like electronics, but for food and water and such, you should be self-sufficient. So there's that. And then the earlier missions, you're going to have like a dozen people on them, and many of those will choose to come home. Most of them will. There probably will be a few that stay, but you can easily bring enough supplies when you only have a dozen people to get there and back with a single Starship. Like Starship has 100 tons. You only need a few tons of food to survive, and a few tons of water to survive the 4 or 5 years that it would require. So this is completely bogus and horrible claim.
On their initial voyage abroad, they could turn around. But once a Starship is headed home, their departure port starts moving further and further away, making it near impossible to return to safe harbor in case of an emergency.
Okay, the lack of ability to turn around is definitely an issue. But you're not going to commit to the mission until you are reasonably certain that you can make it happen. The starships on orbit going from Earth to Mars, they're going to have plenty of time to stock up on their fuel and to test out all of the systems, make sure everything is working great before they commit to going to Mars. Could something happen midway? Yeah, absolutely. But it's not really that likely. I don't think this is going to be a huge issue. And quite frankly, once you're halfway across the ocean, you're still going to have these kinds of issues anyways. I don't think this is much of an issue, but if you had something that happened a week after heading towards Mars, it absolutely could be the case. But if there was something that bad, you could probably send another supply packet there. You could send another ship that was on its way to Mars anyways to help out. There's things that you could do, and these ships will be flying in some kind of a formation, no doubt. They will be able to dock with each other along the way.
The share Martian colonists will enjoy will be the one they take before they enter Starship's payload compartment. Once that exterior hatch is sealed, every breath they take for the rest of their lives will be recycled, filtered, stale air.
I don't really have anything more to say about the fresh air. We already covered that.
And on the ISS, according to Commander Scott Kelly, that air smells like prison. An accumulating combination of body odor, antiseptic, and decomposing garbage. On the positive side, traveling in space can also cause people to lose their senses of smell and taste, so they won't actually know how ripe their stench is.
So the smell on the space station. First of all, there have been hundreds of people on the space station. They were able to operate for months at a time. It may not have always been pleasant, but they were able to do whatever they needed to do. Second of all, there's some mixed reports. I started to search around. Some of them said it's a quite nice station. From what I gather, the specific thing, it smells like antiseptic and rotting corpses. It probably smells somewhat like a hospital. Of course, it sounds a lot worse if you say it smells like a prison, but, it's not going to be a pleasant smell. Fresh air is wonderful. You're not going to get that going towards Mars. But we have the ability to filter air on the space station. We're getting better at it all the time. This isn't really going to be a huge issue. And on Mars itself, there will be glowing plants. There very well may be some form of fresh air because of that. So I don't really see this as being much of an issue except for the journey towards Mars. And, we can put up with things for a few months. The people who are going to do this are going to be the most enthusiastic people. The goal is to have a 1 million civilization on Mars. Really, that's like a hundredth of a percent of the people here on Earth, roughly. It's really not that much.
Rather not bathing. There are no bathtubs in space, just as there are no showers on the ISS and no flush toilets. When their funk gets out of control, these 100 people will have to resort to what we call a sink shower, a wet face cloth or other sanitary wipe to remove the day's worth of dirt and sweat from their skin.
So in space, you're not going to need to bathe as frequently as you would. There's no dirt. I was out pulling weeds this morning and then got showered to get that off. You're in a temperature-controlled environment the entire time, so you have AC. You're not going to be sweating as much. The astronauts don't bathe but once every couple of times a week maybe. And that's perfectly reasonable considering what they're able to do. Once you actually get to Mars, then it's going to be totally possible to survive. I don't think this is nearly as big of a deal as it's given credit for.
And that's particularly concerning while exercising, as they will be required to do for a minimum of 2 hours per day. Without the mandated exercise, astronauts on simple 1-week missions have lost as much as 20% of their muscle mass. And upon entering weightlessness, bodies immediately begin to shed bone calcium at a rate of 1% per month, causing worsening osteoporosis.
So we've already talked about the zero gravity environment on this channel before, but as a quick summary, the period of time going to Mars, which is going to be about 6 months for the earlier missions, and it may be quicker for the later ones, it's really totally survivable. And we don't really know what the effect of Martian gravity, but I'm pretty confident that if you landed a person on Martian gravity, they're going to adjust a lot quicker than they would on the 3 times heavier Earth gravity. Sure, those Martians who survive the whole trip, come back home, haven't been in Earth gravity for a long time, they're going to take some kind of physical rehabilitation, but really there probably isn't going to be that many of them. The goal is to colonize Mars, and you're not going to do that if you are sending people back and forth all the time.
The calcium that is shed through the urine can accumulate in the kidneys and form stones, causing anything from mild discomfort to severe sharp pain.
Kidney stones theoretically could be an issue for astronauts who spend an extended period of time in space, but we haven't really seen this in a huge sense. We've never seen an astronaut with a kidney stone problem while they're in space. They have happened when they're back. This may be a common problem on Mars. It may be that the zero gravity kind of allows them to form but doesn't cause any kind of issues, but when they're in gravity, these are something that we can treat relatively easily. You don't usually need surgery. It's totally possible to make this work, but I'll give you, this would not be a pleasant thing. I'm sure those people who are talking about long duration stays will figure this out, though. It's not that hard. We deal with this all the time with non-invasive procedures. It's totally possible.
Kelly experienced an even worse diagnosis after almost a year in space, which had the potential to leave him permanently crippled. He required extensive physical rehab once he returned to Earth and Earth's gravity, with top doctors and PT professionals.
So, first of all, Scott Kelly's year-long stay on the space station was longer than the time that you would be in zero gravity going towards Mars. We think that the low gravity on Mars will probably be good enough to counteract some of these effects, but we don't really know that well. Time will tell. And then you have the 6 months back. We've pretty much already covered that.
Chickenpox is caused by a virus that lays dormant viruses and other serious medical concerns shingles that reside in human bodies, just ordinary rash pale by conditions to manifest themselves. Bubbling, pus-filled even the simplest things, such as rashes, due to the breakdown of the microbiome we all have on our skin that keeps it healthy. Since
Herpes
showers
or
or baths or viruses are also
most
most often used method
waiting for the opportunity to break out,
antibacterial wipes and dry shampoo,
making meals a
which
miserable.
are harmful to that layer.
Let's delve into
And
this.
rashes
First of
can
all,
also be caused by
none
other
of these
irritants or allergens
viruses
found on
cause
board
the
the
problem
spacecraft.
while in space. Say that again. None of these viruses cause the problem while in space. These are pretty much all treatable through vaccines. When you go to Mars, you're going to have to get vaccinated and quarantined and screened for all kinds of issues, sure. But this isn't really that big of a deal. Okay, this is no worse than going anywhere. And they could theoretically cause a problem when back on Earth, but we haven't even observed that I've been able to find. The only thing that they've noticed is that these viruses that were inactive became activated while they were in space, but it seems pretty minor, really, in the grand scheme of things.
Humans safe.
Yeah, my view on the radiation thing is that there's certainly some risk of radiation. It's not deadly. There'll be some slight increased risk of cancer. So I actually think the radiation thing is it's often brought up, but I think it's not too big of a deal.
So apparently, Elon Musk knows something about cosmic galactic rays that has eluded every actual expert on the topic, including those working at NASA, ESA, and the Canadian Space Agency, who all believe radiation is one of the greatest threats that astronauts will face.
Okay, Elon Musk hit it on the nail on the head with radiation. It is something to be concerned about, but the people who are worried about it are largely, if you look at the OSHA standards for radiation, we've talked about this before, there's something like a 1% chance of an increase of cancer, according to the worst case model, is enough for OSHA to say, nah, not allowable. And if you're trying to stay within those limits, you have issues. If you're willing to take a slightly higher increased risk of cancer, then it's really not that big of a deal. The one thing you really, really don't want, though, is acute radiation sickness, and we are far, far from that. Anything other than that, it's just going to be a slight increase of risk of cancer, and that's something that, quite frankly, astronauts will probably be willing to do. No problem.
Biosphere 2 began. 8 people, 4 women and 4 men, entered the research facility and were to be sealed in for 2 years. The results of that experiment remain controversial, mainly due to the sociological ramifications and fallout of having 8 people locked up together for that period of time. Despite sharing a facility with over 3 acres, just over a hectare, worth a variety of ecosystems, these 8 people still managed to become so disconnected from each other that they formed into 2 warring factions that had absolutely nothing to do with each other due to an ongoing struggle for power. Even after the experiment was over, these 2 groups never spoke again. Adding to their anxieties were the failures of several aspects of their mission. The crops did not produce as expected. The pollinating insects died off. The plants did not scrub enough carbon dioxide out of the air, and this often resulted in oxygen levels dropping as low as 14.5%. The low crop yield meant the biospherians had to eat their own seed stock, leaving them nothing to plant for the next cycle. And they burned through a hidden emergency food cache, which completely negated the experiment, already being criticized for allowing persons to leave who were injured, and for pumping in extra oxygen to make the air breathable again. All of these failures contributed to declining morale, which would also have affected the mental health and social relationships. This was on Earth, in Arizona, in an engineered microcosm of nature that was as close to perfect as the builders could make it during 4 years of construction. They brought in 3,000...
So Biosphere 2. First of all, I have actually been there and I have seen the site. It's a really, really neat experiment. There were a couple of issues with the early experiment. They boil down fundamentally to 3 issues. First one is that the concrete was absorbing carbon dioxide after they sealed off the dome. That resulted in the lower air pressure as a whole, and it caused all kinds of issues. They could solve this simply by painting over it, and that would be enough to get the issues to resolve. If they had let it cure a little bit longer, it probably would have helped out. Second thing is they were a little bit over-enthusiastic about how much microbes they put in the soil. The soil was a lot more organic than normal soil, and as a result, it absorbed a lot more carbon dioxide. The oxygen wasn't produced as a result, it just kind of absorbed it, and yeah, there was that. And the third issue is the plants and trees in there weren't fully developed. It's very, very likely if they took the biosphere now and they closed it off, they could probably get a successful mission, but this was not really possible back in the day, and they learned a lot by doing this. This is why you do this kind of mission, to learn stuff. And no doubt, what we learn from Biosphere will be extraordinarily helpful with the Martian colony when that comes. I hope to see more experiments of this kind performed, so that way we can learn the issues while we're on Earth and prevent issues when we're on Mars. As for the warring factions, well, it's very true that this happened in Biosphere. That doesn't mean that it's always going to happen. We don't see this happen on the space station, for instance. We have seen expeditions to Antarctica that didn't lead into these kinds of issues, that were even more remote settings, really. Like, they had nothing. They survived over the winter in Antarctica. They had very little space they could hang out at. This really isn't that big of a deal. It could happen. It's something we should absolutely be wary of, but I think it's pretty minor in the grand scheme of things.
So Musk wants to cram 100 people into a space measuring about 400 cubic meters after ops and storage decks are removed from the equation for a minimum of a 3-year return trip. There is a reason why NASA has created their minimum habitable volume per traveler guidelines, and it is so that everyone has their own personal space with a little room to breathe. However, if Musk convinces 100 people to travel on a single Starship, each person will only have about 4 cubic meters to themselves, which is not enough room to stretch your arms out without clipping your roommate in the head. And when you've had enough of each other, there's really nowhere for you to go. In fact, they will have less personal space per person than is required for the treadmills the ship must have, or the space needed to don an EVA suit. On Starship, they will have housing decks, each deck with 8 semi-private quarters holding 32 people, the gallery deck, which would also hold about 32 people at a time, same as the quarters deck, and the exercise deck, where the Martians will do a compulsory 2 hours of exercise daily, then remove themselves from the area so others can use the gear 24 hours a day. With 9 to 10 exercise stations occupying a deck the size of a small one-bedroom apartment, there's not going to be much room for socializing or movie nights. Flight deck and ops will be off limits, as will the storage bay, so they will sleep, eat, work out, and repeat. For fun, they can stare out the provided porthole at the void of space, but don't count on the orchestral concerts that Musk promised you in the Atrium.
He talks about these plans for Starship like they're actually the plans, and that it would be such a limited amount of space. Like, we don't know any of this. We don't know any of this. Starship is still being designed. In fact, anything has changed. It changes all the time. The current versions of it won't even have the nose cone to open and close that will allow them to deploy satellites. We really just don't know what Starship is ultimately going to be like. He's basing this off of some designs that some people have come up with, but there's some things that happen, like a flight deck. I don't think there's going to be that big, if anything, of a flight deck. Cargo, they're going to be storing their bags and enough food to get to there, but most of the cargo for a cargo mission is going to be in a dedicated hauler that's going to just carry that cargo. Most of the space of the Starship will be available. I still think, as I've talked about here on this channel before, that the amount of space for a Starship is going to be pretty small, and that carrying 100 people on there is pretty optimistic. But the only time you're going to carry 100 people to Mars is when you have a home for them once they actually get there to Mars.
Mars has a reputation for breaking engineers' hearts. To date, only 40% of the craft that have been launched towards the red planet have actually managed to land successfully.
Can I just say that I hate this statistic? This is so misleading. If you look at every single launch attempt going to Mars from Earth, then yeah, there's a huge failure rate. But that is so misleading. First of all, most of the failures by far were in the early days of the space program. And even more so is specifically the Soviet missions. the Soviets, quite frankly, did not have as well successful rockets as we had in the United States. Pretty much every one of their missions they launched in pairs because they expected one of them to fail. And that's just how it was. We did that for some of our missions, but we certainly don't do that today. The rockets launching failed quite dramatically most of the time. If you limit this to just the United States landing attempts, though, there's only one failure that we have had as a nation while landing on Mars, and that was the Mars Polar Lander, which mostly landed. It failed in the very, very last moments of landing. Yeah, sure, that's a failure, and you don't want that to happen, but we understand how to land on Mars. We're going to need a little bit of work to land a Starship, but once we land a Starship, then it's not going to be that big of a deal. It's going to be the same design over and over again. Would I want to be on the first one? Not a chance on Earth. Would I want to be the first one with humans on? Probably not. But by the time we do that, we're going to have had several landed on Mars already. Elon Musk has said that we'll have at least 2, and we'll probably have more like 3 or 4 that will have landed on Mars before we're ever going to send humans there. Not really going to be that huge of a risk. That's a lot less risk than landing on the moon. When we did that with the Apollo programs, we landed 6 missions on the moon without any problems during the landing phase that were not recoverable, that led to an abort or something like that. The only failure that we had was Apollo 13, and we were able to get that home. It still took a couple of days to do that, but okay, yeah, if we had an Apollo 13 type failure when you're on your way to Mars, it would be an issue. It's a lot less than the early explorers had, quite frankly. The early explorers had a pretty miserable success rate in many ways, but we still have the Americas colonized by Europe, so it clearly was not a huge detriment.
And that's when a 4-point sky crane lowers it gently to the surface in an ideal spot. The biggest reason for the retro rocket crane is to avoid blasting a crater into the very fine, toxic, abrasive regolith, which is the exact opposite of what Starship proposes to do. That dust cloud is never going to settle.
Quite frankly, I don't think that many early Starship missions are going to land without a landing pad. We know the first couple will, and probably the first humans will. Creating a small crater, this was a huge detriment for the rover missions, but it's probably not that big of a deal for Starship. It may make it harder to get home, but keep in mind the goal is to colonize Mars, so if they're not able to get most of the Starships home, they're perfectly okay with that. They only have to get one of the first 6 home, and it will be a complete and total success. So I think they're going to try to pave it for future landing. That's going to be probably one of the last things that they do, pave the ground for the future Starships that are going to come after they have built the refueling station, but it's totally something reasonable to expect, and this will be corrected at some point in time. We can make concrete from Martian dirt. We've studied it in the lab. It can totally work. It's actually fairly strong stuff.
For the cable crane to lower them to the ground, they will all be weak, brittle, and immunocompromised, as they have to begin construction of habitats to live in, and the fuel depot they absolutely need to build to make their way home.
I mean, this is all technically true stuff, but even on Earth, the astronauts are mostly recovered within a couple of weeks, and that will probably be very much the case for Mars, so I'm not too worried about this, but yeah, it is something to be concerned about. We can just hope that the recovery is much quicker when landing on Mars.
The sailors that signed up with Columbus did so with a medieval fear of falling off the edge of the Earth if they sailed too far.
This is a small point, but this is an extremely common misconception. Columbus knew the Earth was round, so did the sailors. They debated exactly what the shape of the Earth was. Columbus had some kind of weird ideas. In fact, his ideas were quite frankly wrong. Most of the scholars knew the diameter of Earth to within reason, and they thought his mission was crazy, not because he was going to fall off the Earth, but because they realized that there was a huge distance between Europe and India. And if you imagine the Americas were not there, that would absolutely be the case. Like, you would be crazy to try that. Now, the fact that the Americas were there, that was not really expected to be the case. And it was a lucky coincidence for Columbus. But it's something we knew. His idea was that the Earth was a lot smaller than it really is, and it would have allowed him to get from point A to point B a little bit quicker, but most of the people knew that the Earth was round in those days.
They had to put up with crappy salted food, cramped conditions, seasickness, scurvy, leaky ships, bad weather, oceanic storm surges, rats, roaches, and a host of unknown factors waiting for them in the New World. 1 month into the voyage, having not seen land since they left, conditions were so bad that the crew began speaking of mutiny.
Yeah, all of this other stuff is pretty much true.
And this still would have been a walk in the park compared to what Musk's million Martians will be signing up for.
So I disagree with this last statement. Like, the people who are actually going to Mars will not be as burdened. You're not going to have to be manning the sails. You're not going to have to do hard work. It's going to be a period of relatively low physical exertion. I think there's going to be a lot of people who are interested in this. But this is really more of an opinion than a fact. Yeah. As a whole, it's an interesting video. And as you guys know, I'm somewhat skeptical of some of these plans that Elon Musk has come up with. But they're definitely a huge step in the right direction. And you have to have some of these kind of visionary ideas and be a little bit wrong. Columbus had a visionary idea to try to get to India. Turns out he was flat wrong, but it still managed to change the world. And I think a lot of that is likely to happen. We'll see, though. And if you guys are interested, we may review some of his other videos. He's got a whole bunch of them on a lot of topics that we talk about here on this channel. But thank you guys so much for everything. Let me know if you guys have any questions. And until next time, keep on tracking. Take care, guys.